News broke on Halloween that HBO has been quietly developing a movie set in Westeros. So, today I want to talk about a couple different options for what I think this could potentially be, whether I like those options or not, and give you a chance to talk about it down in the comments. So, right now or at any point in the video, let me know what you think would be a good idea for a Westeros based movie, and what you think this movie is actually going to be. Let's start by taking a look at what few details we do know about the movie so far, just to give us a baseline of where to start. So, the article that I saw comes from The Hollywood Reporter and says that Warner Bros. Has been quietly developing at least one film set in George R. R. Martin's epic fantasy universe. And then it goes on to say that multiple sources describe the project as very early stage development, with no filmmaker, cast, or writer yet attached. But the company is keen on the idea of Westeros invading cinemas. The article also brings up how D&D apparently wanted to conclude the original series Game of Thrones with 3 feature films rather than season 8, but HBO said no to that. They talk about how since then there's been many changes in who's in charge at HBO, and then they bring up House of the Dragon and Knight of the Seven Kingdoms, and then also point out how it's tantalizing unexplored territory to set something after the conclusion of the original series. I'm sure many of you have seen the article by the time you watch this video, but now that we're all on the same page, the first thing that many people started speculating about when this news broke was that the Aegon's Conquest project that we've already learned about is instead going to be some movies rather than a series. This makes a lot of sense because it's something that's already been speculated about. I know the Dragon Demands has talked a little bit about Aegon's Conquest potentially being a series of movies rather than a TV series, but I've never heard anything concrete on it necessarily. I don't know what exactly is going on behind the scenes, but the idea of this movie that's potentially in the works being Aegon's Conquest would make sense, other than that apparently the report is that there's no writer attached, and the one thing we know about Aegon's Conquest is the writer. So yeah, conceptually, I think the idea of the Conquest works really well as a series of movies, and that may even be what they end up doing. But I don't think that that's actually the movie that they're talking about in this article that whatever sources are hearing about. I could be wrong on that, but I think it's worth it to continue to look for other options. Some other options that I've seen thrown around are things like The Long Night, because that was something that they had a potential prequel series planned for that they didn't end up going ahead with, so maybe they would revisit the idea as a movie. So, on one level, that does make some pretty good sense, but on another level, they were running into some issues trying to adapt The Long Night in the first place. Obviously, if they're trying to do the original Long Night, do they A, just go have it be similar to what we saw The Long Night be in the end of the TV series? Because it's supposed to be a similar thing. The others are invading, it's a similar sort of conflict, right? Or do they do it sort of more similar to what it'll probably be in the books, where it's much more magical? The weirwoods and whatever magic's going on there is probably a lot more involved in the solution and the problem. And then they try and reveal what's actually a more lore accurate version of the Long Night. Well, if they do that, it puts them in conflict with the end of the TV series, and then they have to explain, well, why was the Long Night this way in the past, and then it was this way in the TV series, and, maybe they would do that and it would be fine, but they might stray away from that at least at first. I don't know. Up to you. I'm just trying to throw out a bunch of options and sort of a pros and cons list for each one. If it's on this list, I would say I think the idea is probably at least plausible. So, moving on from the original Long Night, another idea that I've seen brought up that's always an obvious possibility is Robert's Rebellion. There's definitely plenty of drama people would love to see on screen right there, and apparently there's going to be a Tourney of Harrenhal's stage play or something like that. So, we're starting to get some concrete information about things that happened at that time, at least if you count a stage play as accurate information. But in any case, right, like, we're starting to be shown that time period. Maybe they would want to show it to us on the big screen, and Robert's Rebellion as a movie would definitely sell tickets, so it would be a pretty safe option that a ton of fans of the original series would probably turn up to see. So you can see why, from a studio's perspective, there's a ton of pros to doing a Robert's Rebellion movie. The cons come in more on George's side, because George, I think, wouldn't like us to see every accurate detail of the Robert's Rebellion time period until he's written the final books, because there's relevant information that once we see what actually happened there, it'll give us a very strong hint, or even just sometimes straight up the answers to mysteries about the future books. Obviously, the TV show beat him to the reveal of R plus L equals J, but actually just like full on seeing the rebellion, the tourney at Harrenhal, all of these things play out would give us a lot more information than just what we were shown in the original series. I think that overall, Robert's Rebellion is a very likely subject for HBO to want to do a movie on one day. If you were to tell me we were going to get 5 to 10 Westeros based movies, I would say Robert's Rebellion would like 100% be one of them. But if you're to tell me that right now they're working on one potential Game of Thrones based movie, would I expect Robert's Rebellion to be the first one? I would say not necessarily. Definitely on the list. I would say unlikely to be number one, but maybe. The strong connection to the original characters might drive some ticket sales and therefore does make a pretty strong case, but let me know what you guys think. I do think, though, now it's a good time to talk about something the article brought up, something set after the original series, which I've talked in a previous video at least once about how I think this is a bad idea. Without going off on a big long tangent, I think we can all pretty much agree that the ending of the TV series left out a lot of very important magical details that will probably be there in the books. They've been leaving them out the entire series, but at the same time, they seem very relevant in the endgame when you see what was presented with Bran's storyline and the other's storyline. There was definitely ingredients missing that felt essential. HBO could, of course, try and fix this in post by adding a movie that is after the series that just sort of tries to explain all of it and fix those problems, but I think they actually have a much better option in front of them. One of the other things that this article brings up in terms of just transitioning from a movie series to TV or TV to movies is the fact that HBO is currently rebooting the Harry Potter series as a TV series. So, if you start doing the math, you realize it's only been about 20 years since the original Harry Potter movies were coming out, and then you check how long it's been since the original season 1 of Game of Thrones came out, and you realize, oh, wait a minute, they only really need to cover another decade with prequel series or movies, and then all of a sudden, if they really wanted to, George should have one more book out by that point, and potentially maybe the last book, or at least it'll hopefully be very far along, and they can have much more information, a full roadmap, and potentially just everything that they need to reboot Game of Thrones and just do the entire thing right. The fact that they've rebooted the Harry Potter series after 20 years when everyone seems to think those movies were at least fine makes me think that they would definitely be willing to reboot Game of Thrones 20 years later, because pretty much everyone agreed that if there was one series that they would love to be redone with a proper ending, it's Game of Thrones, and HBO has the ability to do that. So I think that they will eventually do that. It probably won't come until George has either fully finished the books or he is so close that it's like actually just completely wrapped up and they can see all of it and just fully plot out the entire series before they even start. But once they get to that point and they can confirm, yes, we know the ending, we have everything planned out, we're going to get it right this time, I think that would be the most well received reboot probably ever. So it's for that reason that I think HBO should definitely reject any possibility of trying to do anything set after the original series, at least for now. You've got House of the Dragon and you've got Dunk and Egg that's going to carry you almost the entire way through, all the way up until you could potentially start talking about a reboot of the original series. You add in Aegon's Conquest, potentially some Robert's Rebellion stuff, the Corlys Velaryon show that they've talked about, all of their other projects, and suddenly you get much closer to just filling up all of the time you need and never actually having to set anything in the world after the original ending. Then you can come back and get the ending right, and then once you do the entire reboot and a proper ending, then you've got all the time in the world to do all the sequels you could ever want. If you're trying to manage your greatest potential property into a healthy long term franchise, I think that's the best roadmap, but again, let me know what you think of all that down in the comments. The next thing I feel like I should talk about, because I have seen some people sort of commenting as though they think this will be the case, is this actually just the reboot of Game of Thrones as a series of movies? Them describing this as a Game of Thrones movie seems to have led some people to react that way, and I'd like to just say I think the chances of this are very low, like 1%. I'm not saying I wouldn't be for it if they knew the proper ending of the series and like had all the notes George gave D&D and were just like, "Oh yeah, we would just actually like to follow everything George wants this time and do it as movies." Fully game, I'm down. But like I said just in that last little discussion there, I think we're still at least 5 to 10 years off from that being even a realistic possibility they're going to discuss. I'd happily be proven wrong, but I think about 20 years is when the window for reboots really starts to open, and we're not quite there yet for a reboot of the original series of Game of Thrones. So, just in terms of that being the movie that's in the works here, I've seen some people react that way. I think that's mostly just because they described it as a Game of Thrones movie. I don't think that's what it will actually be, even though I wouldn't necessarily be opposed to the idea, but probably way, way, way too early. The only way I could ever see it being the case is if they happen to know behind the scenes that Winds of Winter is going to drop in like early 2025 or something, and they have a ton of details behind the scenes and are fully ready to do it as a series of movies. And even then, if you were going to get me to believe that's what we're talking about here, you would probably have to tell me we're in such early stages of development that this thing isn't coming until like the early 2030s. Because at that point, okay, then that time frame makes a little more sense for a full reboot. If they had found out behind the scenes or from George or whatever that, yeah, the next book is almost done, and maybe by the early 2030s the entire series could be done, I could see them starting to be at the early stages of planning for something like this, if that was indeed the case. But I guess let me know what you guys think of the likelihood of any of that down in the comments. I think overall the likelihoods of this actually being a Game of Thrones movie is pretty low. Next, I'd like to talk about something that I didn't see brought up anywhere in the initial reaction to this news breaking, but after thinking about it a little bit, I think does kind of make a lot of sense. So I think I can explain this without major spoilers for how House of the Dragon is going to end by saying that we don't necessarily know how House of the Dragon's going to end. We're in a bit of a weird situation where the source material is a history book that just kind of keeps going all the way for hundreds and hundreds of years, and obviously the series isn't going to follow it to the end of that entire history book. I've also been sitting here trying to figure out, well, if they only have 2 seasons left of House of the Dragon and each of those might only be 8 episodes, how the heck are they going to get to any of the potential satisfying events that they could end the series on? It seems like they just aren't going to have enough time. And again, without trying to go into too many details about what exactly happens at the end of the dance, you could see a scenario where maybe they get to an end point for House of the Dragon, and some fans are sitting here going, oh, well, dang, I wish we had another season to see the thing that happens next, because I really like that thing that happens next, and the thing that happens after that, and the thing that happens after that. And you could see them maybe going, okay, well, if the writers for House of the Dragon have a vision for this story and they want to tell it up to a certain point, the next big event or two could maybe work really well as a movie. For those of you who know what happens at the end of the dance, I assume you can let your imagination run wild and think of, okay, if they end the story here, this could make for a solid movie. If they end the story here, this could make for a solid movie. Maybe that's what HBO would have in the works, but at the same time, that is just me speculating. I just don't necessarily see how they're going to end House of the Dragon properly in so few episodes. But suddenly, if you plan a movie or two to follow it right up, well, maybe that makes a little bit more sense, and it would definitely have that same effect where it would draw in fans of the already popular series, the way that I mentioned a Robert's Rebellion movie would probably do. So that could make it very appealing for the studio to think, okay, well, we've got a team of writers who wants to write the story up to this point. Let's finish it off with a movie or two right after that point because there's still some interesting events in the history books. And this would also kind of weirdly mirror what apparently D&D wanted for the ending of the original series. I don't know if this is what they plan to do, but at the same time, I would feel better about 2 more seasons of House of the Dragon plus a movie or two than I would about just 2 more seasons of House of the Dragon to actually properly finish this story. And if you're going to discuss this one down in the comments, try to add a spoiler tag or do something. Talk about it in a way that maybe people won't exactly understand what you're talking about if you don't know the story already. You know, try not to spoil it for too many people if you want to talk about where potentially you could see the series ending and how they could maybe turn it into a movie. Overall, I think this idea of a movie that would closely follow up wherever the endpoint of House of the Dragon comes is something that would make a lot of sense and might be on the minds of the people at HBO, because they are obviously planning their roadmap around when House of the Dragon will eventually end. All of those factors that I've talked about have this one decently high on the likelihood list, and I would like the idea in general. But again, I don't have any idea what they're actually thinking behind the scenes. There is one more thing, though, that to me just screams as an obvious candidate for a potential movie that would be on the mind of the people at HBO right now, and that is the Blackfire Rebellions. If you're not going to have your movie line up with House of the Dragon, why not have it line up with Knight of the Seven Kingdoms? And at the very least, a movie about the first Blackfire Rebellion could be something that could pair pretty well with whatever you're going to tell in the story of the Knight of the Seven Kingdoms. In theory, you could tell the entire story of the Blackfire Rebellions within the series Knight of the Seven Kingdoms if you wanted to expand it and make it a more Game of Thrones scale epic series with lots of POVs and main characters. But if you want to keep the POV small and focused on just the two main characters of Dunk and Egg, well, then you could have a movie that goes along with it that gives you a point of view of the world at large and what's going on as these characters are going along on their journey. Considering the fact that they're receiving a bit of criticism for how much they've chosen to focus on just Rhaenyra and Alicent during the dance, we've already seen them want to scale down the scope of the main characters, when they could have a perfect opportunity to build a giant, massive cast of many main characters. They instead chose to focus down the scale. And I think that means they're probably unlikely to turn what is actually a story focused on two characters with Dunk and Egg into a more massive scaled Game of Thrones type of thing. I think they're more likely to keep that series tightly focused around Dunk and Egg. But I really do think the idea of having a movie that pairs well with the series that they'll be putting out is something that would really appeal to HBO. And obviously, you can sort of just look at the stories of Dunk and Egg and some of the major world events that are going on at the same time and see some potential options for different movies that they could maybe make. I don't know that they would necessarily do an entire series of movies on the Blackfire Rebellions, but if they did, then potentially you would have Dunk and Egg, starting out on the small screen, and then maybe people would be really hyped when eventually in the series of movies, they see these characters who they know and love appearing and playing a role. However, they would decide to do it, I think having this opportunity to have a TV series and movies feeding off of one another and building hype in a unique way is something HBO may want to take. So, for that reason, I could see them maybe now planning out the series Knight of the Seven Kingdoms and thinking about one or two movies that could run alongside it, which would then lead to the report that we got a little bit ago. So, just overall, I think the most likely options for what this potential Game of Thrones movie that they could be thinking about in very early stages could be is something that would pair well with the end of House of the Dragon or the beginning of Knight of the Seven Kingdoms, or in some way or another build hype off of one of those series. I think they'd like to create this feedback loop where the movie would send people to watch the series, and the series would send people to watch the movies. If that's not the direction that they choose to go, then I think it is probably something along the lines of Robert's Rebellion, or something like that where it's a popular story that many people would recognize that would be sure to bring in a lot of viewers, because I think they will want their first movie to be successful. But overall, let me know what you guys think of all the options that I presented, or anything else that you guys can think of that I didn't mention in this video. Is there anything that you think would be the most likely to be successful for HBO if they turn it into a movie? What would you be the most interested in seeing? I'm interested to hear what you all have to say. Thank you very much for watching and making it to the end of this. Remember to like and subscribe, and I'll be back with something else very soon.